we are fortunate to have three great panelists. Barrett Takesian, in a few short years, has become the poster child for new leadership in Greater Portland, Maine, and far, far beyond. His vision for community outreach and what Portland Community Squash has accomplished has become a national role model. Susan Thornton speaks fluent Mandarin and Russian and was a senior diplomat at the US State Department. Last year, Roberta Jacobson, former Assistant Secretary of State for Western Hemisphere Affairs, described our Susan Thornton to me as the smartest person she had worked with in her own 30-year career at the State Department. And finally, our guest of honor. Fiona Hill, quoting the New York Times, as she was in academia and at the White House, Ms. Hill is a trenchant analyst of a troubled world. She has been appointed by the current British government to co-author with the former Secretary General of NATO and a retired British Army general, a strategic review of defense policy for an era in which Russia is menacing Europe and the US is retreating from it. Please join me in welcoming our panel. Thank you so much.
That's so funny.
I want to congratulate the Freeport Speech Board on a tremendous season, and it's a real privilege to be with you tonight. My name's Barrett Takesian, and we'll get to Portland Community Squash later. But I wanted to start. Susan and Fiona have really had parallel careers, even spending time in the Soviet Union at the same time, and now both with their affiliations to the Brookings Institution. So I'd love to take a back seat for the first half of this talk and have them speak a little bit to their careers and the state of the world today. But in true Fiona fashion, it's always about the solution. So a lot of times we spend the last 5 minutes talking about solutions. We're gonna take the bulk of the hour talking about solutions tonight and make sure we leave half an hour for questions at the end. But before we launch into your conversation, I'd love Fiona maybe just to give us an introduction and some of the topics that we're gonna hit on today.
We've also come to a situation where, very sad to say, there seems to be incredible disregard for human life. You know, we're 80 years since the end of World War II. We're seeing the breakdown of the UN and other larger systems. We promised ourselves we'd never engage in the mass slaughter of humanity again, and we are doing all of this again. And discuss tonight about how did we get there and how we can get out of this. Also, of course, what's the future of the United States relationships around the world? That's pretty critical. Susan being one of our most distinguished Foreign Service representative. I think, you know, what we're really seeing here is the breakdown of the larger global system. And the question is, what do we really put in place? And what we'd like to talk to all of you tonight and discuss with you is how we start both at the top and also at the bottom. And here in Maine, and in the United States as well, we're asking the same kind of questions. And that's why we're so delighted to be here at Freeport for a community organisation that's trying to make a difference. And also to be here with Barrett, with Portland Community Squash being just the exact idea of a community grassroots organisation that's trying to make a difference. So I think tonight we'll try to put all of those things together and talk about how in the international system, as well as the domestic system, we can figure out ways of creating something new. Maybe not building back, but building forward and trying to, you know, basically lean into all of the, let's just say, the players that usually thought of as peripheral or marginal, but actually can make a big difference. So yeah, that's where we wanted to start.
Yeah, I mean, I would just say, picking up on the theme of the UN, you know, there are certainly many countries around the world, I think most, that, as you said, want the UN to continue, multilateral organizations to continue, because these smaller countries, that is the place where they have a voice, where they have a community to come together. They don't have a lot of power in the international system. But they also do want the United States to continue to play an important role there. And I think one of the things that we're getting wrong is that there is a happy medium between the US doing everything and paying, all the dues, and the US really pulling out of treaties and organizations and things, as we're seeing now. I mean, it's possible for the US to have a more kind of tailored or sort of trimmed down or burden sharing in the UN system, if you want, in the multilateral system, without abandoning all these institutions that we've built up over the last 75 years.
And if I could ask, what was it like during your careers when these institutions, as you put it, might have been intact?
Back in the 1980s, the United Nations was where you thought everything was going to happen, where you would have all of the peacekeeping and the interventions, and everybody was always talking about call up the United Nations. And sadly we heard at the most recent UN Assembly, why bother, with the United Nations? But there was that idea that that would be the locus of peacemaking and then obviously keeping the peace. And so that's where I went off. I went to the Soviet Union, and while I was there, Gorbachev and Reagan had the Moscow Summit of 1988, which was that whole feeling that we were on a different trajectory. The missile crisis was stopped by the conclusion of the Intermediate Nuclear Forces, the INF Treaty. I can see again that many of you will remember this, and others will be looking it up on Google. But basically, there was this idea that we were in a new era.
Yeah.
And I think that that's the one thing that I will, take away from this arc of the career, going to Russia in that period and now, 40, 50 years on, thinking, how did we get back to a point where we seem to be in this standoff again with Russia as a successor state to the Soviet Union? What happened to all of that promise? And some of it is a story about failures of diplomacy. Some of it's a story about failures of imagination. But I think a lot of it is a story about complacency and of kind of just thinking that a trajectory, once you got onto it, it could not be stopped, or something would not divert it. And I think for Susan, and I know that a lot of your career was in the trenches, in those far-flung areas of the former Soviet Union, I think it was probably quite obvious to see where things might have gone awry. We couldn't anticipate as we moved on that things might change or might go back to how they had been.
Yeah, well, I remember, and actually I got that same degree in Soviet studies in the spring of 91, which became a degree in history by the winter of 91. So we are very like-minded.
Soviet Union specialists.
Yeah, at least we can read Soviet literature or Russian literature, which is great, of course. But I remember the optimism of that time, and people also even in my line of work in the State Department, kind of just automatically assuming that everything was going to be going on the up escalator.
There must have been a narrative, an American narrative during your time representing this country that you believed in.
Well, for me, America was the gold standard. I came here for the opportunity of a first-rate education, and then decided to become an American, so American very much by choice, and really glad to be here. But what I worry about, that gold standard, is anything but at this particular moment, and that goes for the diplomatic service, and that's already been alluded to by Susan. Everybody looked up to the United States for its institutions, for its soft power. It wasn't just the soft power of American culture, blue jeans and chewing gum, which was the big rage, by the way, in the Soviet Union when we were both there. And unfortunately, coming from the UK, I didn't actually have a pair of blue jeans, so I felt really already kind of at a bit of a disadvantage. But it was that idea that America was a country of promise of democracy, of actually showing an example to the rest of the world, especially after the devastation of World War II, where the United States had been so altruistic and generous, and had really been also the guarantor of stability and democracy in Europe and elsewhere, that this was the place to be, this was the place to look up to. And the Foreign Service was absolutely the gold standard, or working for the United States government, no matter who was in power. The idea was that you were really serving a state that made a difference, and it absolutely was making a difference.
Yeah, and I guess for me, maybe this is the way that we segue to the other part of the conversation. You're such a genius, Barrett. For me, it was really, the U.S. always had ideas, We were, it's leadership. Leadership is the thing that makes the big difference. It wasn't because the US was the richest country in the world. It wasn't because we had the biggest military. It was, we were always there trying to figure out how to solve problems and come up with ideas on how to go forward. And I think that was what really drew me to the Foreign Service. I wanted, of course, to serve my country and support all those ideals. But it's also when you serve overseas, and I worked in, all my posts were high hardship posts because I actually liked that, and it was fascinating. And you don't go to these places for vacation normally, so you can always go to Paris, right, for vacation, but you can't go to Turkmenistan for vacation. But you see these people, and everyone in the State Department has to do a visa issuing tour. So usually it's your first tour. I was in Kazakhstan. You see these people come in, and they're so excited, to go to the US. And they're not wealthy, and they're not famous, and they're not, maybe even highly educated. But it's that idea of going to the US and, seeing Disney World, or just seeing sort of what it's like to be in such a dynamic and open society, right? Especially a lot of the places I worked were quite closed societies. And the idea that you can go to the US and you can sort of start your life over. You don't have any past pedigree that you have to carry with you. And
How did you find what your next chapter was going to be, and what impact are you trying to have on the world right now?
Well, look, I think, like Susan, and Susan, will speak for herself on this as well. When you've been in, these kinds of positions, and you've seen what the potential and the capacity of the United States is, and you see that we're in a time of trouble, and you've worked with some amazing people, you kind of know that you still need to do something, and you have to kind of find a way of working with those other, great people to try to find some solutions for the problems that we're in. And one of the things that's always been extremely important for me, and my home was the Brookings Institution, where Susan also has an affiliation. It's the brookingsinstitution.edu, and it's not a university or a college, but it does have a role in playing in trying to educate the public or impart information, and also in terms of public policy. And the Brookings Institution is a great platform for certainly highlighting issues, working with other colleagues to try to come up with some ideas of ways that we can move forward on a range of things, the kind of things that you're trying to do here in Portland and Freeport and in Maine. But I also I'm somebody who benefited immensely from education. My father was a coal miner. He left school at 14. He didn't have a formal education. He had no qualifications whatsoever apart from things he learned on the job. And he always wanted to, as he put it, better himself and to learn things. And he always, tried to sign himself up for lectures and all kinds of opportunities if, people were there, doing outreach to the miners. And he and my mother, who trained to be a nurse, always said to me, if you get an education, it's basically a privilege, and you've got to do something with it. And education has been what opened the door for me. First going to university in the UK at St Andrews, I had all my education paid for. I got a grant from the Durham Miners Association of $100. It was £100 actually at the time to study Russian. They actually gave it to me in an envelope. I asked the man who'd given me the money, because I wanted this for a language course, probably around the same time you were trying to study Russian. I said, well, what do I do to show you that I've used this money? He said, well, just come back and tell us you can speak Russian, pet. So I've been spending my whole life trying to prove I speak Russian for the Durham miners. And I took that on, very seriously. And I thought, so now, with a role, I'm the Chancellor of Durham University in the UK, back in my home region. I'm also on the Harvard Board of Overseas, which is the advisory board. And I'm trying to kind of figure out, just as everybody else here is, how I can give back in some way. And education is really the key. And this is what's happening here in Freeport. All of this, these discussions that you've been doing, this is part of education, of outreach, what you're doing at Portland Community Squashes Education. All the investments that people here are making in all the local colleges here in Maine. My daughter's a freshman at Colby College. I'm just blown away by what Colby is doing. And I think that this is where we start. This is the strength of America is in education. Harvard was first set up before the country had appeared. The public land-grant universities were set up in the middle of the Civil War, to pull the country forward. We've always found a solution in education, and that's kind of what I'd like to be more involved in the next phase.
Yeah, I guess for me, I'm also affiliated with the Yale Law School's Paul Tsai China Center. That's where I went after I left the State Department. And I totally couldn't agree with you more. My husband's a teacher. We are very big believers in public education, especially. I went to public schools in Massachusetts. And I think education, the thing that gives me hope in my darkest days, these days when half my colleagues at the State Department have just gotten fired, is having students come and talk to them and have class with them. It's so inspiring to see the energy and the sort of dynamic future vision that some of our young people have. And
Well, this is where I kick into gear a little bit.
Good.
So how does the van driving squash coaching guy come to become good friends with Fiona Hill? And why is Fiona Hill in Maine? It's because both of you having seen institutions at every level of our federal government and the global stage, you're here in Maine for a reason. And you're working back in Durham for a reason. Because the solutions right now, it's easier to heal your local institutions and to heal the cultural ailments of division that have been eroding at our bigger institutions. It's always, for me, it's always been ground up. And I'll tell you a little story. I think James and Becca Everett's are here tonight, but Jimmy and I used to get breakfast together in Portland and talk about building a community center using a couple squash courts. And at the time I was working with kids in the basement of the YMCA, and I had a day job crunching numbers. And we did it. A group of people came together and we built a community center. The reason we've gotten some recognition is that we went out around the country looking for the best models in terms of how to build a community center. And it took us all over the country, and we got to Brookings. We had conversations all the way up to the White House, and someone said, go build it. So we worked with the Brookings Institution, Laureate Sport for Good in New York, the Sport for Development Journal in Chicago. We built a peer-reviewed, data-driven, lean, mean fighting machine that's put 700 kids on a path to college. We just passed 1,000 members. We represent every corner of the city of Portland, and we're creating the social bridging and the social capital it takes to get things done. But Jimmy and I, we're aspirational. What's next? What's the next rung of the ladder? And I played with some national foundations, and I worked with the After School Alliance in DC, and I went up the ladder a little bit to check it out. But here you are, I'm still driving the van, and you came to hang out with me. I don't need to go up there. And honestly, the solutions lie on celebrating our community builders. And the more leadership we have, the more community builders. I didn't even know that was a term coming out of Bowdoin. But it's a role I found myself in, and I will go to bat and champion and work with anyone that's driving the van. But our local institutions need business acumen. They need volunteers like the people in this room giving time, treasure, and talent. Anyone can be a flash in the pan and run a great program for a couple of years. Can you build a gymnastics studio or a community theater or a ceramic studio that's going to last for 50 to 100 years? If you're going to do that, you have to build the business engine behind it. And so I think the calling to this room, and I'm curious to hear the projects, and Susan has a project going with soil and farming as well, but we need to strengthen these local institutions.
Yeah, we do.
And we have every walk of life in this little city of Portland. If we can make it work in this city, it's evident that we can do it, bring these bring the UN back, frankly. Like, get these organizations working.
Yeah, and this is not far-fetched. So Tom mentioned at the beginning that I've been involved over the last year with the UK Strategic Defence Review. And this was launched by the Labour government just immediately after it came into office in July of 2024. It was more about how do you defend the homeland, and it's about being resilient. And every time we looked at something, we realised that the fact that there was such huge inequality and glaring divisions in the UK, that there were inequities in health, that there were inadequacies in education, that many parts of the UK, if you took London out, were some of the poorest parts of Europe. And that's usually where people were being recruited, just like in the United States, when there's a lack of opportunities, the military or the armed forces look like an opportunity for people. And it turned out that only 75% of the recruits had just the basic health because of inequities in healthcare, which obviously are experienced in rural areas, to be able to enlist in the military. So we thought, gosh, this is all part of this whole defence complex. Mm-hmm. And how do you fix it? You've got to go to the grassroots. Because it was obvious that the central government couldn't tackle all of this. And the Ministry of Defence couldn't be in charge of people's oral hygiene, or in terms of the educational system or the National Health Service, and there was transportation. Everything was intertwined. So every bit of defence is really about all the things that we're talking about, because it's really trying to figure out how do we make the strongest societies possible.
Absolutely, from a defence perspective. And then you speak to resiliency and the importance of social mobility. Where there isn't hope, that's where there's space for populist ideas to oversimplify our institutions, give you a quick answer, and turn each other against each other. But we haven't said our buzzword that we talk about all the time, which is social capital. I keep finding these studies, people coming from different backgrounds that are coming to the same place. And we were talking about Raj Shetty's Harvard study. Social connection is a 70% determinant of social mobility. It's as simple as forming relationships across all those disparate parts of your community. You're telling me it's national defense, it's resilience to populist ideas and oversimplifications. And Susan, maybe you could share a little bit about how you're using the farm to tackle a little bit of social bridging as well.
So the NGO is called Cultivating Community. Maybe some of you know it. They're in Portland.
Oh, brilliant.
And they are doing fantastic work. They do community gardens in Portland, but they also, bless their hearts, have a farm that they lease in, I think it's Falmouth, and they also work on our farm, part of it. And we have a number of wonderful immigrant farmers from Africa. Some of them have gone off to form their own New Roots Collective in the Lewiston area. They're at all the farmers markets in the region. And they are just the loveliest, hardest working farmers you've ever seen. And it's been such a pleasure to have them.
The reason I got into this work is because we drove a van to the schools, and we're missing so many kids. We're missing that next farmer. We're missing that next cello player. We're missing the next rock climber. When we give kids and families these opportunities, and when I work with programs, I look for multicultural programs and I look for multi-generational programs. I think that's extremely important. But when we do get that family involved, you're giving them a passion for their life. You're giving them a network that's going to create that path to opportunity, to relationships, and to well-being. And that's all we could ask for anyone here in Maine. So the story that I'm going to be working on with Fiona for a long time is, what does a ballet studio in New York, a rock gym in Memphis, Tennessee, and a squash club in Portland, Maine have in common? This is the next wave of American community centers. And the reason we took community centers is because that term doesn't have cachet anymore. What happened? So we're gonna bring it back, and we're putting some real business and some real systems behind it to make sure that community centers are a big part of American life for a long time.
Kinds of things that Maine could become a model or, for other places.
And as I mentioned, Fiona can go on any topic.
We'll talk about that.
So what other topics
question.
are?
Other questions?
I see Asghar here. There's a former Portland Community Squash student at Bowdoin these days.
Oh, hey.
Hey,
Thank you guys so much for being here, and thank you, Barrett, for inviting me. This is a very valuable experience. One question I had geared more towards Susan and Fiona, and all the work that you do, and with major terms aside, like ceasefires and negotiations and peace agreements, connecting back to Barrett's point about own integrities, how do you personally measure success or a job well done in the foreign service and diplomacy?
Oh, great question.
oh dear. But the success you make is you sit down in a room with someone and you start to understand where they're coming from. And then you can actually, if you have to build some trust. They can't think that you're only out to get what you want. Again, it sounds trite, but you do have to come up with a kind of a positive sum goal and work toward that. And when you do that, you build incredible amounts of not only trust and understanding, but also influence, because other countries see that you are actually caring about that they get something out of whatever it is, the problem that you're working on. So I think for me, it was like small incremental wins that maintained that relationship. And I felt like in Washington, a lot of times they didn't really care about the relationship part, which you can't do anything without, maintaining that. So I think that's why I spent 2/3 of my career in the field. I really liked being out in the field. A lot of people like to stay at headquarters. I was a field person, and the Foreign Service is kind of divided that way. But I always got a lot of satisfaction from just working on my problem with my counterparts in that government and sort of trying to push forward a problem and get it, the ball down the field.
Yeah, I would agree with that completely. And that's a really good set of examples.
Barrett, how do you measure success?
Well, the Barrett that sits on a computer all day has to look at data, but the reason I do it, I'm one of the most relationship-rich people in this room, and I want the families that I work with to enjoy the same riches that I've been fortunate to take from my work at Portland Community Squash. So access to well-being, access to relationships, access to opportunity for every person that I have the pleasure and our team has the pleasure of working with.
Yeah.
Other questions?
But I think the biggest problem that we have, as you're alluding to, is access to education. And the big divide in our societies in the US and in the UK is who gets an education, who doesn't. So basically 60% of Americans don't have anything beyond high school, including high quality vocational education. And it's actually the same in the United Kingdom. And you're getting then a kind of feeling that education is a luxury item that's exclusive, not inclusive. And of course, that's why Harvard and other places have come under attack, because an idea that they're trying to basically provide a luxury good. And if you think about all the investment in the facilities and the perks for students, that's often how it appears. But I think that, given all the research that's going on in places like Harvard, for example, you mentioned Raj Chetty, and his group at Harvard and MIT, who've done all this pioneering, research on social mobility, social capital, inequality. There's obvious ways in which the educational institutions can put, their research into action and to apply it. And I think, as we look into the future, the kinds of things that Colby is doing in terms of revitalization of Waterville, or this new announcement of all initiatives up and down the Maine coast, other universities and colleges are doing that, as well. All of these platforms are now being developed to make the content of classes at MIT and Harvard. They have this online platform called Axim that they're making available to community colleges and to other institutions across the US and internationally. And of course, Arizona State University's got this amazing model, as I'm sure many of you are aware of, where, for example, Starbucks has a deal with ASU where all of its employees can basically take courses online, and they've got a rule where you can just enroll online in courses, and if you got a B average, even if you're not paid for the courses, you can then enroll into a full-time course. You can get credit for those courses. And they've got some more students enrolled in ASU internationally and in the United States may actually have on their multiple campuses in the system. So I mean, there's another, model of approaching this. And I think that's what we're going to have to think about. We're going to have to think about how we adapt the educational system to give everyone access to something. You could have universities working with vocational schools, not being forced to do it, but just doing it as a matter of course. And this is what we have to do. We've got to create a whole ecosystem of this, and you're doing that already at Portland Community Squash, because many of the people
I
that
think
you've mentored have now gone on to college and
Sure.
to other positions and things.
Well, I think the stories that resonate with you are the creative pivots that universities are making. We're going to be at the Rue Institute tomorrow morning having
Yeah.
some meetings with the leadership. I mean, that's a university that came in and said, we want to be embedded in the local business community day one. And that's a novel model, ASU novel model. Colby making massive investments in Waterville. That was a big bet that's paying off. But as a big, wealthy institution, and Fiona will be at the Harvard board meeting this weekend, it's your responsibility to make yourself relevant to your constituents. And in many cases, similar to Durham University in the UK, you're in a town that really needs you. And so how are you going to make yourself relevant to not just your 2,000 students, but the 200,000 people that live in the greater metropolitan area around you?
We all know that there has always been an undercurrent of religious intolerance, both at the grassroots level all the way up to the top. And I am assuming that each of you has run into situations where you have had to address that. Can you speak to that and how we as a community can become more tolerant of one another for these most basic self-understandings that we hold?
I think that was a wonderful last question. Thank you for asking it.
Yeah, and it's a very big question. I think both of us in the roles that we were playing, the whole effort was to be tolerant and accepting of everyone from every faith and creed and imaginable background. I mean, that used to be at the very heart of the Foreign Service and across the US government. This kind of idea that everyone was welcome. To be honest, I mean, that's when I came to the United States back in 1989. I thought that was what the United States was all about. Because so many people, came to the United States from other places having been persecuted for their religion, for their ethnic background or, so many other things, political positions. And I think that this is, something where all of us have to really rise to the occasion. We all have to find a way in our own lives and in our communities of changing that approach. The more that we can, bring that back through these kind of efforts, the better.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's the reason I'm in Portland, Maine is because I believe Portland can be that place. And just bringing it back to national security, we took on this brave topic of global issues and local solutions. But I've seen so many first-generation families bring their culture, bring their religion to Portland and succeed and support their families in every corner of the world. We're so lucky to have all these families in Maine, and it is such an important national security interest that the U.S. can be a breadbasket for communities all over the world. I know families that live in Sudan that have a tremendous goodwill towards Portland, Maine, because their Uncle Alari is here working 3 jobs to send money home and to be that bridge of opportunity. So Portland, we have the opportunity to get it right. I think it's an absolutely worthwhile pursuit, and I appreciate you asking the question.
Yeah, hold on, Barrett.
Thank you, Barrett. Thank you, Susan. Thank you, Fiona.